Good evening, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you all at this interactive webinar on international factoring, helping cash flows and mitigating risks. Friends, today's session has been organized by Federation of Indian Export Organizations and Apex Trade Promotion Body of India in association with New York Business Advisory and Corporate Services, Inc. That is NYBACS. NYBACS is a New York-based company that offers international factoring similar to invoice discounting and cross-border payment solutions globally with a special focus on Indian businesses, entrepreneurs, and startups. Besides international factoring, NYBACS also offers business advisory, US, and global incorporation services. They have helped around hundreds of Indian businesses, entrepreneurs, and startups to go international with their end-to-end service offerings. Friends, factoring is a global industry, as we all know, with a vast turnover and has gained significant importance in the recent years. This method of payment was used in order to ensure that companies could continue procure raw materials and produce output without any interruption. Factoring helped the businessman getting benefits in having consistent cash flows, reduced credit risk, and investing their productive time on their core activities. After having seen the impact of industrial revolution, both the domestic and international factoring started gaining popularity at an impressive rate in most of the countries. Although there are several methods of settlement like open account, advance payment, and documentary collection, a strong alternative called factoring has been most widely used by businesses in different parts of the world to settle their international trade transactions. To know and understand more on this topic, we have organized today's webinar. We have pleasure and privilege to have with us Mr. Peter Clement, International Business Director, Sten International USA, Mr. Mukund Srinivas, Senior Advisor, Advisory Partner, New York Business Advisory and Corporate Services, Inc., NYBACS. From the Federation side, we have Mr. Ashwani Kumar, Regional Chairman, FIEO Northern Region, and also significant number of Indian companies from all across the country. May I now request our Regional Chairman, Mr. Ashwani Kumar, for his welcome address, please. Sir.
Thank you, Ashish, for giving me this opportunity. And I welcome Mr. Peter Clement, International Business Director, Sten International USA, Mr. Mukund Srinivas, Senior Advisory Partner, New York Business Advisory and Corporate Services Incorporation, NYBAS, exporters from India, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Federation of Indian Export Organization, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you at this interactive webinar on international factoring, helping cash flow and mitigating risks. Friends, the significant recovery in the key economic and business indicators on the back of the string of bold economic reforms, along with aggressive vaccination drive in India and various countries, have instilled expectations of a strong and sustainable growth in a positive territory in coming quarters. Although we have just witnessed the second wave in our country, but the latest data reveals that witnessed that a second wave in our country, but the latest data reveals that the growth in the COVID-19 cases have significantly gone down, and with the collective efforts of the government and everyone, I'm sure we will successfully come out of this situation very soon. Further, I'm happy to inform that the businesses are back to the recovery track as business activities across the sectors picked up last month, aimed falling infections and gradual relaxation of COVID included restrictions in the various parts of the country. It is equally satisfying to note that India's exports continue to perform impressively on the back of the goods order, good order booking, and the gradual opening of the key global markets. The sustained growth in exports of about 50% with the US dollar 35.43 billion over financial year 2021 and by 35% over financial year but 2019-20. Yet again demonstrated the strength of resilience of the export sector. This is highest ever export record at the least in the previous 9 years, as per the data readily available with FIEO. It also is a sign of that the global trade is recovering fast, which gives us a hope of achieving ambitious target of $400 billion merchandise export as set by the government. Friends, as the international trade accelerates and takes momentum, it begins a new opportunities and challenges as in the present COVID times. The availability of cash flow to the organization will play a crucial role in maintaining the sustainability and the growth of business. Here, factoring can come as a viable financial solution that helps companies stabilize cash flow by unlock the cash sitting in unpaid receivables. Friends, factoring has been in exercise since the dawning of the trade of commerce. It can be trailed back to the period of Mesopotamian king Hammurabi, a Perswasi, used this concept began American colonies before the revolution started. During those times, raw materials like timber, fur, cotton were shipped from the colonies, and before they reached destination, merchant banks in London and other parts of Europe used to advance funds to the raw material. The practice was very beneficial to the colonists as they don't have to wait for their money to begin their harvesting again. With the Industrial Revolution, concept of factoring got narrowed down to the credit. In 60s and 70s, with the increase of interest rate, there was a surge in private factors. The trend strengthening in 80s with a further increase of interest rates and changes in the banking industry. Under factoring, business concerns sell their invoices, that is account receivable, on factoring company in exchange for an immediate advance on the invoice value, thereby allowing companies to cash in on their sales without having to wait for the payments to come from the customers in the due course. Thereafter, the factor collects the full amount from the debtors and pays the balance amount to the business concerns. This service is usually provided for a fee which depends on the sales of the volumes, number of customers, number of invoices, credit notes, and degree of credit risk in the customer or in transaction. Factoring is widely used in transportation, medical, staffing, construction, manufacturing, service sector, international factoring has become well established in developing countries. In popular, those that they are highly industrialized. In various Asian countries, the growth of factoring has been dramatic, while in Latin America, the financial institutions continue to join the industry. Similar growth has occurred in Central Europe, the Baltic, and Middle East. Friends, there is no denying the fact that the factoring plays important role in international in open account term payment is received many weeks or even months after delivery. International factoring provides a simple solution regardless of whether the exporter is a small organization or a major corporation. The role of factor is collect money owned from abroad and approaching importers in their own country and the own language and the locally accepted manner. As a result, distances and cultural differences ceases to, to be a problem. While factoring is not a new concept in India, it is certainly on a very low scale. Unlike India and Western countries, the factoring is most sought of after financial after finance channel for MSME and MSMEs in those countries have been generally empowered to leverage their invoices to receive timely payment from the buyers. Recently, the Indian Parliament passed a factoring regulation. Amendment Bill 2021, which is now paved way for a huge change and boost up factoring industry landscape like never before. It will further open more credit facilities for MSMEs, which is very good to help Indian business understand and benefit out of this. FIEO, in collaboration with NYBACS, has arranged this webinar, which would help you to detailed information about the factoring. I'm sure the experts present today will deliver deeper into the topic and cover all aspects of factoring. With these words, I would like to again thank the dignitaries and the experts present today. I'm sure Indian companies participating will be make their best use of the session and interact by interacting with them in will be highly benefited. With these words, I thank very much. I thank you very much for inviting me as the Northern Region Chairman. It is uh, my privilege to be with you, and definitely I will be listening to you all and to get benefited out of the factoring. Although we tried to do it before, but there are some reasons it was a bit cumbersome because we are small scale industry, and now I think we can by the passing of the new law, we will see what the best can be done by the government of India. I wish you best of luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for sharing the overview of the factoring, and I'm sure the experts present today will be giving more details on that. I would now request Mr. Peter Clement, International Business Director, Sten International, for his presentation. Mr. Peter Clement is an accomplished senior executive manager with 25 years of vast and rich experience in growing businesses, deals in the industries of trade finance, insurance, and consumer goods, with ability to optimize resources and evaluate risk when establishing new business partnership. Over to you, Mr. Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Jain, and thank you, Mr. Kumar. Would first like to thank the Federation of India Export and the New York Business Advisory for organizing this webinar and providing me with this opportunity to speak to everybody. Perhaps I will just start with a quick overview of my past history and how it relates to today's factoring webinar. So prior to joining Sten, I was with COFAS North America for about 20 years. I was the National Broker Director in North America. Why that's important is most of Sten does come from the trade credit insurance space, and that's what allows us the expertise to vet international risk, which, you know, at the forefront is the most important when considering factoring products. We have over 30 people from COFAS, Atradius, Euler, other trade credit insurance carriers who first and foremost are able to give advice to the sellers on whether or not they should be selling their goods on open terms to their respective customers overseas. And in the event that that credit is deemed a good credit, then obviously we can facilitate factoring. I'd like to continue some of Mr. Kumar's previous comments. There's a few different perceptions of factoring that I would like to clarify for everybody. And this was a learning experience for me while I was at COFAS for my 20 years. When people hear factoring, there's a couple of perceptions inclusive of people factor because they're not bankable. People factor because their customers are not creditworthy, and most importantly, factoring is very expensive. And I've come to find through my career at COFAS since then that it's actually the complete opposite. So people factor for various reasons. Some people just simply don't have the back office and need a factor support when it comes to a, you know, credit due diligence or a collections facility. And to Mr. Kumar's previous point, most importantly today, people are factoring for cash in hand. So another distinction I would like to make is factors, well, at least then, do not require full portfolios. We actually will allow sellers to pick and choose which customers and even which invoices they'll factor with Sten. And as long as that customer is credit worthy, we offer the seller the opportunity to pick and choose to factor that receivable with Sten. We will basically pay 90% at shipment. And then, as Mr. Kumar mentioned, once the buyer repays Sten, then we remit that 10% back to the seller minus our fee. So it's a full non-recourse relationship. So Sten basically is assuming all of the risk and allowing the seller to receive cash in hand at shipment. So we're doing the due diligence for the seller. We're providing them cash in hand. You know, listen, today's market, you may have great relationships with your customers, and I'll give you an example. I had a client with COFAS for about 20 years. They were selling into Brazil, which, as you can imagine, is a very difficult country to sell into. They would go to dinner, have golf a couple times a year. But at the end of the day, my client had reservations about having $1 million outstanding with this customer in Brazil. So he had enough margin in this product that he decided to start factoring that invoice. Because the point was, he would rather have $900,000 in hand at shipment than hope and pray to be paid by that buyer in 90 days. And it has nothing to do with relationships. It has to do with being diligent and doing what's best for the business. And in today's market, as everyone is well aware, cash is king. And what made sense for this particular customer was getting $900,000 in hand so he can reinvest that money back into the company, knowing that Sten basically was taking all the risk if, God forbid, the client didn't pay us. So on that note, I'm going to share my screen and go over a short presentation with everyone. And then I would definitely invite any questions, from the audience. So Sten has grown considerably even through COVID. As an example, we've received almost $1 billion in investments since last April, and this is throughout COVID. We're backed by companies such as Barclays, Cradle Capital, and the Texas Bank, and now HSBC. So you can see that during COVID, we have investors that are investing almost $1 billion to support Sten's growth. There is a lot of opportunity in India. Our top 3 supplier countries are India, China, and Hong Kong. So for those that are not familiar with factoring, there's a lot of your, maybe competitors or colleagues in the country of India that are successfully using Sten's factoring services. We are transacting in over 80 countries worldwide. India is both a buyer and seller approved country for Sten. And as you can see from the chart, we have local representation globally, and our portfolio has grown 4 times over the last 12 months. We are 6 years old. So you can see when you're talking about $1 billion over 6 years, you can see how significantly Sten is growing, and more importantly, factoring in general. Just want to go over the metrics of how factoring works. So as I mentioned, first and foremost, the first thing that Sten will do for you is the credit due diligence. Basically the supplier will go into the Sten platform, request a credit limit on their customer, hopefully provide us with financials, and Sten will come back and say, we can approve that buyer for X, or we cannot approve that buyer at all. And here are the reasons why. So we're giving you credit information of why we can or cannot transact with that customer. Sten is one of the very few factors in the world that can take their own credit decisions. And that's because that we've convinced our investors that we have the expertise from our credit insurance history to properly vet credit. We have every credit agency and report available into the market in our possession. And we are obviously well-versed in reading financial statements. I will be very honest with everybody on the call. It will be imperative that Sten receives financial statements from the buyers. In many cases, the buyers do not want the sellers to receive their financials for obvious, proprietary reasoning, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, either Sten or its insurance partners will probably require financials depending on the size of the credit limit that's being requested. That's just the reality of the situation. And obviously that's been escalated because of COVID. The underwriters want to see the business in 2019, how the business was impacted in 2020, and how it's reacted the first 2 quarters of 2021, which is, to be expected. So assuming that we have a credit limit in place, how it works is the seller will upload the transaction documents to Sten. The transaction documents are inclusive of a purchase order, a commercial invoice, a packing slip, and most importantly, the bill of lading. So the goods have to have shipped, whether it be by air or boat. They have to have left port on open term sales. Sten will buy that receivable from the seller, pay them 90%, and then remit the 10% back to the seller once we're paid by the buyer. Traditionally, the longest terms that Sten will accept is 120 days. We can consider 180 days if the buyer is publicly traded or investment grade, but I would say realistically speaking, we're talking about open terms in 120 days. Size of the invoice, the range is actually pretty dramatic. I've seen invoices as low as 50,000, and I've seen transaction as high as 50 million. So as you can see, we have a pretty big scope of transactions that we can consider. And of course, it's all predicated on the strength of the customer buying the goods from the seller. Next slide, an important slide. People say, well, how fast do you transact? I would say the first transaction is usually inside of 2 weeks. The second transaction is usually inside of 2 days. Obviously, once the due diligence is done on the seller and buyer, they're both approved in the system. The transactions flow very rapidly. The first transaction, as you can imagine, is always a bit longer because we're doing our background checks on both the seller and the buyer. We do not require financial statements from the seller. Sten is just making sure that they're in business for at least 12 months. There's been no previous bankruptcies or frauds attached to that. And then the seller is approved to transact with Sten. From the buyer perspective, it's actually obviously a deeper dive. You know, we want to make sure again that there's been no blips in the system as far as their pay decks, how they're paying their customers, and more importantly, we're looking for financial information depending on the size of the transaction. Just to give you an idea, if the transaction is, let's say, $250,000 and lower, we may not require financial statements depending on how much information is available, you know, via the credit reporting available to Sten. But if you're transacting 500 million through 50 million, then obviously financials will be required by Sten or its insurance partners. Most of the transactions are now going through the Sten platform. So basically, you know, our introducers such as New York Business Advisory will introduce their seller to the Sten platform. Their seller will then basically run the credit on the customers that they're selling to globally. And then assuming that the buyer is approved, then they'll simply upload the transaction documents for Sten's operation team to consider. I'm going to pause now and just see if there's any questions from the audience that I can answer.
Thank you, Mr. Peter. But what I would suggest is that once we have another speaker, once he gives his address, probably thereafter we'll take the collective questions from all. With all the speakers. And thank you very much for giving a comprehensive presentation and also telling us the mechanism through which this factoring process works. May I now request Mr. Mukund Srinivas, who is a Senior Advisory Partner, NYBACS, that is New York Business Advisory and Corporate Services, Inc., for his remarks, please. Mr. Mukund.
Yeah. Hello?
Yeah, Mr. Mukund.
Mr. Peter, please, Mr. Peter, please stop this presentation. Thank you. Mr. Mukund, please go ahead, sir. Mr. Mukund.
Yeah.
Mr. Mukund, there is a voice issue here from your end, sir.
Mr. Mukund, I would suggest you just log off and rejoin again.
Hello? Yeah. Ashish?
Mukund, you are not audible.
Mukund, you can rejoin. You can rejoin from your mobile.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Mukund, you can rejoin. You can rejoin from your mobile.
Mr. Jain, maybe should I answer some questions while we wait for Mukund to rejoin?
Yeah, I think till the time Mr. Mukund joins, I would request the participant to just raise their queries for Mr. Peter. In fact, you participant can press the raise hand button on the screen so that we can identify you and can invite you for your queries, please. Just press a raise hand finger, raise hand button on your screen in case of any queries you have for Mr. Peter.
And I see a couple of questions in the comments section. The first is what discount rate is charged by Sten for factoring services? So I mentioned previously that we can consider transactions from 50,000 to 50 million. So that's obviously a vast degree of transaction size. And with that comes a vast degree of discount rate. So I would say our lowest discount rate is about 7.9% APR. So just going back to my comment about the perception of Sten or any factor being expensive, we charge less than 1% per month. How much less than 1% per month is predicated on the flow of transactions that come through our program. So you're talking about anywhere between 7.9% and 11.4%, depending on how much volume is coming through the Sten program. And the second question, as far as Incoterms, most of our transactions are unsecured. So we're basically funding on the credit worthiness of the buyer. So we're looking at FOB terms on open terms, anywhere between 30 and 120 days.
Thank you, Peter. I think Mr. Mukund is there. Mukund, are you there? Would you like to address? I think there are some technical issues with Mr. Mukund. I would request other participant to just raise their query. Just press the raise hand button on the screen in case you have any queries with Mr. Peter. Yeah, we have Mr. Kushang from Sanskar Creation. Mr. Kushang, you can raise your query. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a question for Mr. Peter over here.
Yeah.
Mr. Peter, one question: are all the factoring services provided? Are all the the limit provided are non-recourse? And second question is, do we need to, exporter also exporter like us, do we qualify for some amount of already been made to the buyer? Is there any particular criteria to qualify?
Mr. Peter, please unmute yourself.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, Mr. Peter, you can reply.
Yeah, there's a lot of background noise. I didn't hear the first question. As far as the second question is concerned, what Sten is looking for is a buyer that has positive net income, positive equity, and a debt to equity ratio of better than 6 in a roundabout. I mean, our underwriters are very proactive and will have open discussions with buyers for the purposes of trying to improve credit and getting more of the story of how the buyer, the history of the buyer over the last 2.5 years. But if a customer, will not share financials or has deficit net equity or deficit, net worth, that's not a risk that Sten is looking to entertain. We have very flat rates, again, predicated on volume. We do not upcharge, for, let's say, poor risk. For Sten, it's either yes or no. We don't apply more expensive rates for poor risk. It simply will pass on the opportunity.
Mr. Kushang, you can raise your first query. Mr. Peter could not get it.
I asked the first question is all the limit provided, like are all the limits provided is non-recourse?
Yes, everything that Sten does is non-recourse.
non-recourse. And for someone like a new exporter like us, we'll be making our first shipment. So even you can.
Yes, we don't require any previous history between the buyer and seller, although it's obviously more useful. As long as your company is in business for X amount of months, but you're new to exporting, we're here to support you from the credit due diligence standpoint and to provide you with liquidity.
Right. Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
May I now request Mr. Shivam Mahesh for his query, please. Mr.
Hello.
Shivam Mahesh,
Hi.
please
Hi.
raise hand.
Yeah. Is it audible?
Yeah.
Hello. Is it audible? Yeah. Hi, Peter. Thanks for the webinar. I have a couple of things, right, which you have clarified me on the discount rate, which ranges from 7.9% to 11% based on the value of the discount, right? Based on the amount we are discounting. Is it correct?
Our discount is basically predicated on the full value of the invoice. So the 100% value of the invoice.
Right. I got that. So it doesn't depends on the strength of the country, or it only based on the face value which you are countering. For example, roughly if you are making a $3 million, so in a year it's 36 million. So if that is the value of export for which discount factoring is requested, what will be the discount rate?
So anything over $10 million outstanding between the seller and any of their buyers would be 7.9%.
That's on USD, US dollars, 7.9% on US dollars.
Correct.
Right. So do you have, I understand that you have a Mumbai office where people are working there. Do you have contact details for that so that we can connect to the Mumbaiers for asking a personal questions related to the company?
Well, I mean, everything that I do goes through the New York Business Advisory. So, they would be the liaison between, anyone that's looking to work through Sten.
Okay. So how do you contact you?
I believe that Mukund and the Federation of India Export will provide you with their details at the conclusion of the call.
Yeah.
Right.
Shivam, we will be sharing the contact details of the organizations as well as the panelists present today with all our participants.
Right,
don't
sir.
worry.
Thank you.
We'll
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
share the contact details. Yeah.
Thanks.
Uh,
Thank you.
Yeah. Mukund, are you there? Because I don't see any raise hand as of now.
Yeah, I'm yeah.
In fact, let's remove the PPT from the screen, please. We have Mr. Lalit Mahendru who has raised his hand. Mr. Mahendru, please.
Yeah, hi. Well, it was fantastic to know about this, but there, so much noises are coming from the background. We are not able to understand half of the things. Unfortunately, the clarity is not there, and the question that being asked and the answer that is being given are not clear at all. So,
Mr. Mahendru, we really apologize for that. I don't know, there are some technical issues, but nevertheless, you can raise your query now. And in fact, further also, you can, whatever queries you have, you can send it to us as well as to the expert present today. We will forward to them.
No,
you just raise your query now because, although we have muted all the other participants, I could not see any other participant unmuted.
No, my query was same. The person, who just asked and, I was not able to get the answer clearly that Mr. Peter has given. So what
you can
I
ask it again, please.
What I understood that they charge on the basis of the FOB or CIF value of the invoice, and it's gonna be a per order basis, not on a yearly basis. How it goes? On an order basis or on a yearly basis, they do some sort of contract with the company. How they do it?
Yeah, Mr. Peter.
So it's actually invoice by invoice. So the more invoices that the seller puts through the Sten system, the cheaper the overall discount rate will be. So we have what we call a sales term sheet, yes, that we provide to all of our clients, but it does not force anyone to use us, for a full portfolio or even for that customer. You're able to pick and choose which customers and even which invoices are factored with Sten. So basically, the seller controls the discount rate. The more business that is provided to Sten, the cheaper the overall discount rate will be.
And how do you charge? Like you said that you charge from 7 point something to 11%. So do you have certain slabs? On that basis, you charge like the invoice value should be this on that.
So Sten charges on the back end. So let's say someone brings us a $500,000 invoice on August 1st.
Okay.
You're going to be, realistically speaking, you'll probably be charged 11.4%. That's our most expensive rate. That's because the overall cumulative outstanding AR is less than $1 million. But let's say that invoice is net 90. And on the 89th day, you bring an invoice for $5 million. Both invoices will actually enjoy a lower discount rate because now the cumulative outstanding to Sten is 5.5 million. So we always charge our discount rates on the back end when we remit back to the seller. So we're basically incentivizing the seller to give more and more business to Sten.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Mr. Peter. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Thank you. May I now request Mr. Sanjeev Ahuja to raise his query, please? Mr. Ahuja.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Peter. Is this factoring applicable for all the countries across the globe, or are there any criteria for that? And second question is, if the documents are routed through bank with the credit term, so are there any change in the rates for that, or is it same for the open terms?
So our rates, it's either yes or no from a credit perspective, and our rates are predicated on volume only. So either Sten or insurance partners have to agree to the credit limit, and then our rates will be determined on the cumulative outstanding, that's outstanding to Sten.
Okay, and is factoring applicable for all the countries, or are there any country risks, specific country risks where you don't have the factoring, especially for the Turkey? It's like, for example, if I export to Turkey and if I opt for factoring, will it be applicable?
So Turkey, unfortunately, is not an approved jurisdiction for Sten. It's a very fluid list. I could let Mukund distribute the list again at the conclusion of the call. We do Bangladesh, we do United Emirates, we do Singapore, we obviously do the US and the UK, but we recently lost Turkey, Argentina, Greece. So it's a pretty fluid list. It's tied to factoring regulatory, it's due to political unrest, and obviously the credit in that respective country. But most of the countries that you have in mind, obviously the Americas, all of the APAC region, and Europe we're very strong in. Our weakest, if there's such a thing, our weakest jurisdiction sector is probably Africa and some of the Middle East. But we do Kuwait, Israel, the UAE from a seller's perspective. I would say Africa is probably our weak part of the globe.
Okay.
Mr. Peter, I would suggest if you can share the list of the countries with whom you are doing this thing, so that we can share with our participants. Because similar kind of a query we have received in the chat.
Yes, absolutely.
And one more question which I could see in the chat is that is there turnover limit for the company for availing this facility? If you can respond to that also.
There's no limit to the sales turnover of the seller. The buyer has to do at least $3 million in turnover for Sten to consider a credit limit. But there's no minimum turnover required by the seller.
Okay. We'll take another question from Mr. Dinesh Nagdev. Mr. Dinesh, you can raise your query, please.
Yeah, actually one more question. is it applicable for Russia also? Is it possible to finance Russian customers?
We do not cover Russia.
But here the thing is like our consignment is going to Russia and the payment is coming from UK. Ultimately, our buyer is in UK, right? But the consign is in Russia. We are getting the payment from your UK supplier, UK customer. Sorry.
As long as the seller is invoicing from an approved jurisdiction and they're invoicing a buyer also from the approved jurisdiction, then the transaction can work. The final determination will be from our operations team. But as long as the buyer is invoicing, as long as the seller is invoicing a buyer and they're both in approved jurisdictions, then yes, the transaction can work.
Okay, so you did not cover Russia at all, like any specifications or any specific customer? No, but you don't cover Russia, right? Fine.
We do not cover Russia. We do cover China.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. May I now request Mr. Arun to raise his query, please?
Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah. Okay. Please.
Rather from the seller's end, can this factoring request can be raised from the buyer's end? Is that possible?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Rather raising this factoring request from the exporter, can the importer request for this factoring option?
Yeah, so realistically speaking, sitting in the United States, which is a more import-driven jurisdiction, most of my submissions come from US importers who are introducing me and Sten to their overseas suppliers. So the buyer is driving the deal. Technically speaking, the seller will always be Sten's client because that's who we're buying the invoice from. And the buyer will be our risk. But yes, in many cases, the buyer is driving the program.
Okay, thank you.
I will just add to that the buyer cannot pay the discount fee. The seller will always assume the discount fee from Sten. And it may be the reality that the buyer repays the seller the discount fee, but that will not involve Sten. That will be between the two parties to negotiate outside of the Sten relationship.
Okay, thank you.
Peter, there is one query from in the chat box. Is Slovakia covered in the jurisdiction?
Bear with
Slovakia.
me. Let me just double check. I'm not sure about that. That's not a country that's requested all too often. I'm good, but
I
I
would
don't have
suggest you
everything.
share the list of the countries with us so that can be shared with our participants.
Sure.
Yeah. Ashish, I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
So Slovakia is covered.
Slovakia is covered.
Yes.
Okay. So for the person who had raised this question, just for his information, Slovakia is covered. So we'll have another question from Mr. Rangarajan Rathinam. Mr. Rangarajan.
Yeah, is there any restriction with regard to the currency? Should it be invoiced only in dollar or it can be in any approved currency? For example, apart from US dollar, euro, Australian dollar, pound sterling. Is there any restriction?
All the currencies you've just mentioned are approved. Canadian USD, British pounds, Australian, Japanese. We didn't. I mean, off the top of my head, the only currency that is usually requested that we will not consider is pesos. But the major currencies that you mentioned are accepted by Sten.
Okay, thank you.
Although we do prefer USD.
Right, understood. Thank you.
Welcome.
I could see one query in the chat box. I am a small exporter for Dubai and I am exporting like green peas and beef amount $50,000 to $1 lakh and credit period of 3 months. Is there any bill discounting applicable?
Yes, so I mean, that is a perfect example of what Sten does and does well. I mentioned our success in India, and I would add that some of the industries that we're doing really well with in India are food, consumer electronics, telecom, and obviously apparel. Those are the industries that are doing really well. So for an invoice less than $1 million and for 90 days, it would definitely be something that fits into Sten's bucket. And they'd be looking for, a discount rate of 11.4% APR, which nets out to like 0.95 per month. I guess I should
Thank
ask
you,
the
Peter. I
question,
hope
they're exporting from Dubai to where? I guess it depends what countries they're selling to.
in fact, I could not see any raise hand button on the screen. Friends, if we don't, yeah, there is Mr. Lalit Mahindru. Mr. Mahindru, please raise your query.
Yeah, hi again. My simple query is that whatever the details he is presenting right now, we just request FICCI to send us across, with complete terms and conditions and, the list of countries where they have approachability and all. So that will help us to understand with the presentation PPT better.
We will share. We will share,
Absolutely.
Mr. Lalit. Definitely. We'll request Mr. Peter to give us a brief of whatever he has shared with us along with the presentation so that it can be shared with all the participants.
And secondly, do we have another presentation or should we allowed to leave? Should we wait?
I don't think so. There is any other presentation. I think Mr. Mukund is there, but unfortunately his audio is not working because of some technical issues. You can, in case you have some other fixed appointment, you can leave now. I'll take another query from Mr. Sangu. Mr. Sangu, you can raise your query. Mr. Sangu. Mr. Sangu, are you there? We'll proceed with another, query of Mr. Ashwin. Mr. Ashwin, you can raise your query, please. In the meanwhile, we see if we can rejoin.
Mr.
Mr.
Clement?
Ashwin, yeah.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Yes. Usually when the buyer pays us, it comes to our account. But in this case, it would be Sten that would be paying the supplier. So how does that work? In banking terms, because Sten would not be mentioned anywhere in the invoice.
No, we don't require Sten to be mentioned in the invoice, but on all transactions, we will send the buyer what's called a notice of assignment, where the buyer and seller will acknowledge that the payment will be made to Sten's account at day 90 as an example.
Okay. And hopefully that should work with our bank as well, because our bank otherwise may ask for a tri-party agreement saying that Sten has paid on account of the buyer.
Yeah, we have a template. We obviously work with a lot of Indian companies that the bank will acknowledge that Sten will be receiving the payments on behalf of the seller. So that's something that the New York Business Advisory can send you as well.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Mukund, are you there in case you would like to add? Because I don't see,
Almost there.
Hi, Peter. This is Shiv again. Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, please. Yeah, please.
Yeah. See, like it is in line with the previous speaker question that if you want to have a factoring thing, that I understand it will be from the Americas. If that be the case, that assuming, for example, $100 million I'm exporting, after exporting, uploading everything in the digital platform, and by that I will receive money in dollar, or how it will be, whether I will receive in INR or it will be receiving in dollar.
Yeah, we would ask that you're invoicing in USD and you'll be receiving money from Sten in USD.
Okay, if that be the case, as in line with the previous speaker, we have the India government restriction saying that if I export to China, say for example, and there is a shipping bill which will be pending against the China, which the government expects the money to be received from China to close that shipment. So in that scenario where I would be receiving the USD from you, and it will be kept open that I have been exporting to China. So if it would be an INR case, then situation won't happen because it's kind of a INR transaction where on the due date, this could be settled. That is, on a due date, you will receive the money and you will close that. And that way we can work out through your bank. So, and also one part is the technical part involved in that. And apart from that, there is an exchange fluctuation also matters, because when you transfer money in dollars to us, it will be credited in INR, where we will have the exchange impact also in the account. So
yes, Sten will not consider that as an eligible transaction unless you're invoicing in USD and the Chinese buyer would be paying Sten in USD.
Then now I will close the regulatory thing in India, because I would have done export to China, but I would receive money from you. So then there should be an agreement in place to close that. So that is what the previous speaker was asking.
Yeah, well, so when Sten remits monies, the initial 90% and even the 10% retention, we send a file recapping the discount rates, and our existing clients take that to the bank on top of the previous agreement where the bank recognizes that Sten's involved in the transaction. And to this point, we've had no problems with Indian business. I guess it depends on the banks that everyone's using, but we have a lot of successful business in India.
With India. Okay, right. Thanks.
You're welcome.
I think, Shivam, I would also like you to connect with Mr. Mukund in that case, because they have already been doing such kind of factoring offering services with a lot of Indian companies. In fact, as what Mr. Peter and what our other speaker was talking about, in fact, there needs to be consultation or approval from the bank in terms of getting these kind of transaction done through factoring factors.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Right, sir. Thanks.
Maybe friends, we don't have a yeah.
Yeah. So if I could get the contact after, as you are saying that, if you could get the contact of Mukund also as well. Yes.
We will share, definitely we will share. In fact, we don't have any more queries, and I would request our participant, in case any of the queries they have, they can send it to us. We will forward it to the panelists present today. In fact, we will also share their contact details. You can also send them directly with a CC to us in case there is a need to follow up with them with regard to your queries. With these words, we would like to conclude this session today. I would like to sincerely thank Mr. Peter Clement, who has joined us from New Jersey, US, and also Mr. Mukund Srinivas, although he could not join because of some technical issues. He's representing NVBACS in India. He was joining from Hyderabad. And I would also like to thank our regional chairman for joining us. And also all our members of the Federation who have joined in large number for this interactive webinar. Once again, thank you very much. Thank you all. And for any further queries, you can always write it to us, and we'll be more than happy to respond to all your queries. Thank you. With these words, thank you. Have a wonderful day. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.